January 4th, 1964. Mary Sullivan's body is found in a small apartment in Boston. She's 19, sometimes reported as 20, sitting on her bed, posed. A card that reads, "Happy New Year," is propped against her foot. The city had already been on edge for more than a year. Neighbors locked their doors. Women installed extra deadbolts. Advice columns told women how to check a peephole. But still, this happened, in the place most of us think of as safest, home. I'm Mara Ellison. This is Still Unanswered. Today, we revisit the Boston Strangler, a story of fear, of headlines that turned into a monster, and of a complicated, unfinished record that even DNA hasn't fully resolved.
Mara, that opening image, Mary propped on her bed, a card, it's almost cinematic. And it explains why the case lodged itself in the public imagination. But beyond the image is a forensic reality that was, at the time, thin and fractured. Hi, I'm Lucas Harrington. I've been studying mid-20th century serial crime for decades. What we have in Boston is a mix of preserved detail and bewildering gaps. Those gaps are important. They shape every theory that follows.
Right. And I want to be clear from the start. This episode centers the victims. We will walk through the crime scenes, the police work, the confession, and the modern DNA breakthrough. And we will also hold the uncertainty in our hands. This isn't about melodrama. It's about asking, how did a city and a whole country come to accept one neat answer for a very messy history?
Exactly. And, Mara, the cultural backdrop matters. Early 1960s Boston, post-war prosperity, the suburbs expanding, but a growing number of single women renting city apartments, nurses, secretaries, teachers, widows. It was a time of anxiety. Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of JFK in 1963, so the murders fed into a wider climate of dread. Investigatively, there was little DNA, limited centralized record-keeping, and jurisdictional silos. All of that shaped how the case unfolded.
Let's slow down and start at the beginning. The canonical list usually includes 13 women killed between June 14, 1962 and January 4, 1964. Ages ranged from the late teens to their 80s. Some lists differ. Already our first hint that the story is messy. The first woman often named is Anna Slessers. She was found June 14, 1962, in her Boston apartment, strangled with the belt from her robe. She was 55. At first, the press called this an old lady killer. Then, younger victims were attacked. The profile shifted.
One thing to emphasize, there were recurring elements across many scenes. Strangulation, sexual assault, sometimes a ligature left in a bow, nylon stockings or belts used as makeshift garrotes. But even within those similarities, the scenes differed meaningfully. Staging, signs of struggle, the victims' ages and circumstances. That's a red flag in modern behavioral analysis. Single offenders can have variety, but such variation can also point to different perpetrators.
And for listeners, when you hear signature, there's a tendency to imagine an identical ritual repeated each time. But the Boston scenes weren't identical. Some victims showed little to no sign of forced entry, which made people wonder, did they let the killer in? Was there deception? A friend? A tradesman? Women reported being approached by men posing as repairmen, as modeling scouts, what DeSalvo would later be accused of being. But again, not every scene conforms.
Right. Before we get to Albert DeSalvo, it's important to describe how haphazard policing could be. Municipal departments in Boston, Cambridge, Lynn, Lawrence, each with their own files, their own protocols, did not share information effectively. That created blind spots. A collaborative Strangler Bureau was eventually formed under Attorney General Edward Brooke, but only after panic had spread. Those early months mattered.
Let's pause on that panic. It wasn't only police who felt the pressure. Women bought tear gas, changed locks, and some packed to leave the city. Advice columns published how not to be murdered checklists. And this is important. Media coverage often framed the victims in ways that blamed their independence. They were single women living alone. That detail was repeated as if it were an invitation.
The media's construction of a single Boston Strangler accelerated public fear and investigative pathways. Newspapers sold copy with that label, which then filtered back into police thinking. A word like strangler focuses the mind on strangulation as a unique signature and invites the assumption of a single roaming predator. It made a tidy story out of messy facts. There was even a point where investigators brought in Peter Hurkos, the Dutch psychic, because of mounting desperation. That should tell you something about the intensity of pressure.
Hurkos. Yeah. That image, police consulting a so-called psychic, has become shorthand for the chaos of the early investigation. But it also illustrates how badly they wanted a single narrative. And then came the media branding, books, a 1968 film that leaned into psychiatric explanations, and later retellings that cemented a single villain in the public mind, which, as we'll argue, might not match the evidence.
Before we dive into DeSalvo's life, one more scene detail. Mary Sullivan. Her body was reportedly posed, and there was that Happy New Year card. Little physical evidence from many scenes survived, or if it did, it wasn't cataloged the way we would expect now. The Mary Sullivan case is different. The blanket preserved a semen stain that decades later offered a DNA lead. That bit of preserved physical evidence is why modern science could weigh in at all.
Okay, Albert DeSalvo, born 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts. A violent, abusive childhood. Early brushes with crime, burglary, exhibitionism. Then a pattern of sexual predation. The measuring man, who posed as a modeling scout, and the green man, who entered homes, tied up women, assaulted them, but generally, until later, left them alive. He was a predator with a practiced set of cons for access. That matters when you consider how many victims reportedly let their attacker in.
DeSalvo's history makes him a realistic suspect for certain assaults, pattern of deception, access, and sexual predation. But the leap from attacker to serial killer of the range seen in the Strangler case is not automatic. Serial killers can escalate, yes, but in DeSalvo's record before 1964, the fatal assaults weren't part of the pattern. He was dangerous. Whether he was the murderer of all 13 victims is precisely the contested point.
And it's worth saying, again, that when DeSalvo was finally arrested in October 1964, it wasn't initially for murder. He'd attacked and bound a woman who happened to survive. She gave a detailed description. That same day, he'd tried another home and fled when a homeowner with a shotgun fired at him. He was arrested primarily for the string of sexual assaults, green man crimes, not as the Strangler.
While in custody, the story takes a turn. DeSalvo was housed with George Nassar, a convicted murderer. According to accounts, DeSalvo confessed to Nassar that he was the Boston Strangler. The confession then reached F. Lee Bailey, who agreed to represent him. DeSalvo later gave lengthy confessions, detailed narratives of 13 murders. Those confessions included some non-public scene details which gave investigators reasons to believe them. But the interrogations were complicated.
Complicated is putting it mildly. The confessions were given under circumstances that now draw a lot of criticism. DeSalvo was speaking to other inmates and to attorneys. He was shown crime scene photos. He was in a highly suggestible position. Over time, researchers, journalists, and even some investigators noticed he made factual errors, getting room layouts wrong, sequencing wrong, in ways that suggested he either didn't remember or had been contaminated by media accounts. Lucas, can you explain how suggestibility like this can affect a confession?
Yeah, a confession in and of itself is not conclusive, especially in an era before modern interrogation safeguards and before the psychology of false confessions was widely understood. Suggestibility was common. DeSalvo may have been seeking notoriety or an opportunity to negotiate his fate through claims of insanity, or to attract attention for possible future book deals. Then there's the role of Nassar, whose motivations could have been mercenary. Bringing forward the confession to his attorney could be a bargaining chip. This doesn't prove DeSalvo innocent of the murders, but it complicates how we interpret his statements.
He was never tried for the Strangler murders. Prosecutors felt they might not get a reliable conviction on homicides where there was little physical evidence, so they prosecuted him for the Green Man sexual assaults, cases where victims and material evidence were stronger. He was convicted in 1967 of those crimes and sentenced to life. The public, newspapers, officials, many members of the public then began to accept case closed. But the record remained incomplete.
And that incompleteness is crucial. A confession plus existing pattern can be persuasive, but forensic corroboration is the gold standard. In most of the canonical Strangler cases, either biological evidence didn't survive or was never properly cataloged. That leaves us with one decisive modern touchstone, the Mary Sullivan DNA. That single link changed the debate, but only partially. It proves DeSalvo killed Mary. It doesn't, by itself, prove he killed the other victims.
Let's walk through the 2013 breakthrough. Investigators had stored a small piece of the blanket from Mary Sullivan's bed, where semen was preserved. Advances in DNA testing led police to use familial DNA techniques. They retrieved a discarded water bottle of a DeSalvo nephew. Yuck chromosome testing pointed to a match in the paternal line. That alone was strong. They then exhumed DeSalvo and tested his DNA directly. Confirmed. Massachusetts officials declared no doubt he killed Mary. But here's where the nuance matters. The public heard Boston Strangler identified as if it settled the whole case.
It didn't. Science gave us certainty for one victim, Mary Sullivan. The problem is the other scenes, different victims, different evidence profile, remain largely untestable with current material. So, does proving one murder tie together the whole series? Some prosecutors say most likely yes. Others, and many independent researchers, say the variation among the cases leaves room for multiple perpetrators or for DeSalvo being culpable for some but not all. It's not a trivial distinction.
And that distinction matters to families. Casey Sherman, Mary Sullivan's nephew, is one of the most vocal critics, even after the 2013 DNA result. He's spent years pursuing alternative leads, and he's been central in pushing for release of additional materials. In recent years, he unearthed about 60 hours of previously unreleased DeSalvo confession tapes that, he argues, show coaching, suggestion, and even outright inaccuracies. Lucas, what should we make of those tapes?
Tapes are tricky. On one hand, they can show the exact wording of questions and answers, enabling us to assess contamination, coaching, and suggestibility. On the other, Tapes released decades later are often decontextualized, edited, partial, or interpreted through advocacy. From what Sherman and others assert, elements of the tapes indicate DeSalvo was shown photos, corrected by questioners, and sometimes repeated media noir facts as if they were his own. That pattern raises legitimate doubts about the reliability of his admissions beyond Mary Sullivan. But it doesn't, by itself, exonerate him of the murders he may have actually committed.
Casey and others have even pointed to another suspect, someone who failed a polygraph, who had a partial DNA match, and allegedly had motive and opportunity. Some of those claims are contested, and others hinge on missing or mishandled evidence. There's even a thread that evidence was stolen or lost. And this is where institutional behavior becomes a recurring theme. Paperwork lost, evidence misfiled, jurisdictional infighting. Those operational failures make full retrospective answers harder to obtain.
Which returns us to a larger problem. When investigators are under enormous pressure, closure can be prioritized over cautious interpretation. A neat conclusion, one man, all the murders, is politically and socially satisfying. But from a historian's or a forensic criminologist's standpoint, neatness shouldn't trump probative detail. The DeSalvo confession sits between those impulses. It offered closure and narrative, but it came with inconsistencies and later scientific partial confirmation.
And the public loves a tidy monster. Books like Gerald Frank's 1966 The Boston Strangler, and films in 1968 with Tony Curtis, and later helped lock that image into place. The 1968 film portrayed DeSalvo as suffering from dissociative identity disorder, an angle not supported by the clinical record. The cinematic DeSalvo became an iconic villain. Films often simplify and dramatize, and in doing so, they can close the conversation, even when the evidence is open.
Art does that. It tells stories that are digestible. That has cultural impact on how juries, prosecutors, and the public think. It also shapes the way victims are remembered. Some narratives focus on pathology. Others focus on institutional failure. Both matters are real. The question we keep returning to is, did the cultural desire for a single culprit eclipse a cautious investigation of the possibility of multiple offenders?
Let's talk about that multiple killer theory. Some retired detectives and researchers have argued that the earliest victims, often older, living alone, could have been killed by one man, and later victims, sometimes younger, in different neighborhoods, could have been killed by copycats or different individuals who exploited the panic. Evidence supporting multiple killers includes the varying victim ages, different degrees of sexual violence, and inconsistent staging at scenes. Lucas, what do profiling and pattern analysis say about that possibility?
Behavioral analysis supports both possibilities. Serial offenders may vary in victim type as their compulsion evolves, but typically we see consistency in fantasy and post-offense behavior. In Boston, the spread from elderly women to a 19-year-old is wide. The ligatures and strangulation mode recur, but other elements shift. Copycats are a real phenomenon. When a crime gains notoriety, other sexual predators may mimic certain details. Therefore, the multiple killer hypothesis is plausible and can't be dismissed solely because the press preferred a single villain.
There are even institutional incentives to settle on one answer. Police wanted to reassure citizens. Politicians wanted to show competence. Suppose an investigator gets a detailed confession from a man already in custody for related sexual crimes. There's a temptation to accept that confession, close the case, and move on.
That doesn't mean investigators acted maliciously. It can simply mean human systems look for closure.
Absolutely. Institutional incentives are powerful. That doesn't exonerate errors, but it contextualizes them. One other point. Before DNA, forensic corroboration meant fingerprints, blood typing, fibers, evidence that was less definitive in many of these scenes. The lack of preserved biological samples in several of the cases wasn't always negligence. Sometimes it was the scientific reality of the time. That said, in a case series as consequential as the Strangler murders, better preservation would have been crucial.
Mary Sullivan's case shows both the limits and the power of modern science. The blanket preserved a semen stain. Labs in 2013 used familial Y chromosome testing to track a paternal line, which led to a discarded water bottle from a DeSalvo relative. That led to exhumation and direct testing of DeSalvo himself. The lab said, match. For Mary, that's closure at a scientific level. But the ethical and practical questions around familial DNA, sneaking a water bottle off a nephew's front porch, sparked debate about investigative boundaries.
Right familial DNA techniques are incredibly powerful, but ethically thorny. Retrieving a discarded bottle is legal in many jurisdictions, but raises privacy questions. It doesn't necessarily indicate misconduct, but it does illustrate how forensic practice has evolved. The result in the Mary case is forensically robust, but again, it's one link. The broader narrative of 13 linked murders remains contested. That distinction is important for historical accuracy and for the victims' families, who may have different answers for each death.
Casey Sherman and others have argued that DeSalvo was a pawn, that perhaps he took blame or was encouraged to claim responsibility for the full set of murders. Some allege evidence was mishandled or that other suspects were ignored. Other investigators and prosecutors say the DNA and confessions are convincing enough to treat DeSalvo as the strangler. This is where still unanswered exists, at the uncomfortable intersection of certainty and ambiguity.
Yes, and it's worth noting that DeSalvo's death in prison, stabbed in 1973, compounded uncertainty. He reportedly told his family he had something important to say the next day. He never did. The official murder remains unsolved. He was silenced. That silence became part of the mythology. If he was going to recant, why kill him? But violent prison dynamics can explain murders without invoking conspiracies. We need to be careful not to fill gaps with seductive narratives.
Still, there's a powerful moral question. When one murder in a series can be proved by DNA, should that settle public narrative for all the murders? Or does it create a dangerous complacency where the rest are archived as solved by confession, even when physical evidence is absent? I think victims' families deserve better than an easy story. They deserve precise answers, and when those aren't available, we should say so plainly.
Agreed. Forensic science can answer certain questions decisively, but it cannot retroactively manufacture evidence that wasn't preserved. The lessons here: better evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, careful interrogation practices help prevent future uncertainty. And from an ethical standpoint, investigators and journalists should resist simplifying narratives when the record is complicated.
Before we close, let's reflect on cultural legacy. The Boston Strangler became a shorthand for male predation, for the vulnerability of women living alone. It spurred changes in policing culture, in public safety advice, and, unfortunately, in sensational media. It also created a cautionary tale about how storytelling can outpace facts. Lucas, what's the core forensic lesson here?
Preserve everything you can. Coordinate across jurisdictions. Treat confessions skeptically without corroboration. And be humble about what the evidence truly supports. For historians, be skeptical of tidy narratives. For the public, demand careful investigations. For families, recognize the double burden they carry, grieving while also turning over every stone for truth.
And a final question for listeners. How do we live with unresolved conclusions? Not every case yields a single final answer. Some are partly true. Some deaths can be proven to one man. Others remain open. That ambiguity is unsatisfying, yes, and it can be dangerous if it leads to complacency. But it also demands vigilance. We keep asking. We keep investigating. We keep centering victims. Lucas?
We remember the women, Anna Slessors, Mary Sullivan, the others, each a life, each with friends and family who wanted answers. DNA gave one family a measure of certainty. It didn't close the entire book. So what we owe them is continued scrutiny, an acknowledgement of uncertainty, and this is important, better systems so future families don't live in the same limbo.
Thank you, Lucas. If you want to read more, we've sourced contemporary reporting and the forensic coverage in our episode notes. WBUR's reporting on the 2013 DNA breakthrough, Boston Magazine, archived news stories, and the books and films that helped shape public perception. We'll link those for you. And, as always, if you have information, memories, or questions about this case, reach out to Still Unanswered. We'd welcome thoughtful, documented leads, especially anything that helps reunite families with more clarity.
And one last thought. History and forensics walk together, but they don't always march in step. Be precise in how you use words, linked to versus sole perpetrator, because language matters. Thank you for keeping this conversation rigorous, Mara.
Thank you, Lucas. We'll be back next week with another episode that refuses tidy endings. Until then, take care of one another, check the little details, and don't be afraid of the questions that linger. This has been Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Good night.